Very honored to introduce Brother Jason Richards, past master of Acacia Lodge number 16 in Clifton, Virginia, and co-host of the Masonic Roundtable. Is that right, Jason? You're Brother Richards' fascinating topic for tonight is Pythagorean Numerology, its form and legacy. Brother Richards, I'll hand it over to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Brother Aaron. And, just a quick note of thanks to everyone here. Always humbles me when I get asked to come and speak on topics that folks may or may not find interesting. And so greatly appreciate your willingness just to have a great, fun dialogue around the power of numbers, because that's really what this is. I will say you all are, for better or worse, my guinea pigs today, because this is adapted from a paper I wrote for the Virginia College SRICF, but have not presented this really as this adaptation as such. And so this is something that, esoterics are very new to me, generally speaking. I've been a Mason for over a decade now, which is absolutely crazy, but I only started getting into more esoteric philosophical topics within the past 2 to 3 years. And so one of the things that always fascinates me is the alignment with, or the alignment between the hard sciences and the mystical and the spiritual. And so when we talk about numbers, it has been said that numbers are kind of, can be the language of the divine. And so the purpose for this conversation tonight, and do hope it's a conversation, especially with the Q&A, the purpose is to, kind of take you through, a history of attaching symbolism to numbers, and then starting to see how that symbolism has kind of flowed throughout history, and where it's ended up today in Freemasonry, outside of Freemasonry, within the tarot, even up through the Jewish and Christian Kabbalahs, into Christian mysticism today. And so big focal point is going to be on Pythagoras, but then also how that's represented today within the tarot, and to a lesser extent within the Masonic Lodge. So humans have, I think, since time immemorial, sought to create frameworks for understanding and communicating, the concepts from the world around them. Whatever we can do as humans to bring order to the chaos helps us understand the world around us. And ancient creation mythologies, including the Book of Genesis and the ancient Sumerian and Chaldean or Babylonian creation accounts, these are all rife with frameworks, whether they be motifs or archetypes or symbolism, designed to communicate kind of intangible, divine, and complex ideas in a way that humans can understand them. And so when we talk about numerology, specifically for this presentation, the lens that I'm viewing numerology through really is using arithmetic and numbers as a framework for transmitting complex ideas to bring order to life's seemingly kind of incoherent and overwhelming chaos. More succinctly, numerology employs the simple numbers to convey the complex ideas. And so we kind of think about numerology as, almost its own language, to help us understand a little bit of that ineffable, concept of deity. Ancient mystery schools have sought to use different symbols as their own languages in a similar way to numbers, to convey and impart hidden truths, to explain all of life's phenomena. and up to and including the nature of deity. And one particularly influential mystery school that used numerology as this framework was the Pythagorean mystery cult that was present in southern Italy in the 6th century before the Common Era. So what we're trying to do with numerology is use numbers as a language and a means of conveyance and symbols in and of themselves to help us understand the divine. So, of course, we have to talk about numerology's number one fan in Masonry, and that is Albert G. Macky, who said that, numerology is to arithmetic what astrology is to astronomy. It's a form of occultism. There's no evidence of any infiltration of numerology into Freemasonry. In a larger quote, he actually goes to specifically say that that William Preston and Desaguliers and James Anderson would have seen any form of occultism as abhorrent. Never mind the fact that Desaguliers was part of the Royal Society. We won't go there. But as Ron and Aaron so aptly put, in this case, I kind of see Macky as the wet blanket of Masonry, in the sense that Macky very much is talking specifically about divinatory numerology. And so divinatory numerology really got its start back in the Chaldean and kind of Proto-Babylonian Empire. So the Babylonians kind of developed out this concept that numbers and letters, like matter, consisted of energy vibrations. And different numbers vibrated at different frequencies. We'll see some of the same stuff within the Pythagorean mystery cult. But by kind of matching those vibrations and those numeric counterparts, energetic qualities, the Babylonians could then engage in some sort of divinatory fortune telling that Pythagoras also did, to reveal hidden truths about persons and phenomena just based on the vibrations of their names. And so Macky is very much railing against this concept that we now know as like gematria. And while kind of I will reserve judgment for divinatory numerology and gematria, what I'm specifically focused on is, okay, what are some of the relatively immutable symbols and concepts that have been put onto numbers, and how do those influence Masonry? So that, yes, we can have Macky railing against occultism and pseudoscience, but at the end of the day, speculative Masonry was built on Sir Robert Moray attaching symbolism to real Masonic, or rather operative Masonic tools and symbols. And so for me, Macky's beef with numerology really doesn't matter, because as speculative Masons, we use symbols to communicate higher truths all day long. So let's talk a little bit about Pythagoras. Much of what the modern world understands about numerology and geometry really had its genesis with the Pythagorean mystery school. Born approximately 580 BCE, Pythagoras was a Greek mathematician, philosopher, and occultist, and he traveled throughout much of the Middle East and Southeast Asia. He finally settled in southern Italy and founded a mystery school here in Croton in southern Italy. And it was based on the four liberal sciences broken into the science of numbers, which included music and arithmetic, and then the theory of magnitude, which included geometry and astronomy. It's really interesting because Pythagoras reportedly divided his disciples into two categories. So he had kind of a subdivision within his mystery school where he had the exoteric, which were the the disciples who were taught just the very base knowledge of numbers and geometry. And then he had a much smaller subsection of his mystery cult, which was the esoteric group, where he really kind of imbued this, this occult learning on numbers, really representing the entirety of the perceivable universe. The Pythagorean mystery school flourished for about 40 years until political change and upheaval kind of came to the Croton area, which caused Pythagoras and the school to flee to just up the coast to Metapontum. And Pythagoras died shortly thereafter, around 500 years before the Common Era. Now, upon Pythagoras's death, much of the mystery school's teachings, doctrines, and history were lost, due to the fact that largely the Pythagoreans were, unlike the Masons, really, really good at keeping their secrets. What little we know about the Pythagoreans, their doctrine, their teachings and contributions, really come in fragments from Pythagoras's contemporaries and his successors, most notably Aristotle and Herodotus. Historians credit the Pythagorean mystery school with popularizing a bunch of revolutionary ideas, including using philosophy for spiritual purification. Oh, hey, how like Masonry. The requirements for secrecy. Again, another Masonic and secret society link. And, most notably, really, the Pythagorean linkage of numerals and reality. And so through Pythagoras and his disciples, numbers represented the totality of the perceivable universe. And it was an inseparable link between numbers and reality. So looking at, four principal numbers really to start. I intend to expand this out a little bit more to cover like 5, 7, and 9. But I just started with 4 because they're just so densely packed with symbolism. The Pythagoreans came to regard knowledge itself in the form of numerals, and those numerals became those symbols that Pythagoras and his pupils used to understand and convey, all objects and ideas, whether tangible or not. The number 1, also called the monad, represented intuitive knowledge. 2, the dyad, was reason and causation. 3 was imagination, essentially the product of intuitive knowledge and reason bringing motion into focus. And then 4, or the Tetrad, which was really the ability to observe the entire observable universe. Stepping through these sacred numbers, we come to the monad first, or 1. Pythagoreans used the numeral 1 as a symbol for deity and intellect. The monad being the genesis of all things, the primordial progenitor, and remaining itself forever unchanged. In geometry, the Pythagoreans represented the monad as a point because it has no beginning, it has no end, and they depicted the numeral as a circumpunct. In line with the monad representing the creator deity, the numeral further symbolizes gender, albeit interestingly enough, it symbolizes both genders together, kind of akin to a hermaphroditic being or rebus, because you need both genders together, intertwined, in order to make it necessary, or in order to make it possible for creation to take place. The Pythagoreans, in addition to representing the monad, or using the monad to represent deity, they further liken the monad to the sun, this being not only a representation of deity, but then also an alchemical symbol for the sun. the numeral 1 evokes unity, as you cannot divide one against itself. So it is essentially unity, creation, manifestation, the all at the beginning of the universe. When we move forward kind of into, broader esoteric thought, we see some of these Pythagorean ideals now projected onto things like the tarot. So in the Rider-Waite deck, we have the magician, who's represented as number 1. And the magician is the card, solely focused, really pinpointedly on manifestation and creation. The magician here has all of the elements together on a table, represented as, earth, fire, wind, and water, the cups, pentacles, swords, and wands. And he is using those base elements to create his entire experience and ultimately the entire world. And so this musician character, is taking on that godly creator figure, and very, very much kind of symbolizing the ability to create and keep everything in balance, kind of with that as above so below stance that he has. In Freemasonry, we see the circumpunct figure prominently, especially in the EA degree. We have, the ends of the circle kind of bounded between zeal and introspection, or, St. John the Evangelist and St. John the Baptist. And while we are trying to keep ourselves as Masons, somewhere in the middle of the two, ideally as close to center as possible, because we as Masons are trying to, again, make ourselves the best people that we can be, in some ways getting as close to the divine as possible, to the point where, it's said we can't materially err. So moving into the number 2, also known as the dyad, this is where things get a little dark. The monad symbolized unity and oneness, and the dyad symbolized separation and divisiveness. For the first time, you had something, kind of break away from the all to then become separate. This is the first time that separation is introduced kind of into the world. And so the Pythagoreans are said to have revered the numeral 1, but they despise the numeral 2 due to its audacity of kind of separating itself from the one true deity. So Pythagoreans conceptualized the dyad as opposition, evil, darkness, and inequality. They also associated the dyad with the concept of anguish, due to its intrinsic nature of desiring to reintegrate into the one. The monad symbolized intellect and wisdom. The dyad symbolized ignorance. But it also represented reason and causation, because it is essentially the first product of causation. And so the Pythagoreans ultimately viewed the dyad as the first inherently female or feminine number. And so they used it to symbolize important female and mother mythological characters like Phrygia, Ceres, Venus, Juno, and Maya. What we have here, with the high priestess is, one of the most powerful, female characters within, or female archetypes within the Rider-Waite tarot. Interestingly enough, the high priestess is meant to represent balance, and so there's much less of a focus on antagonism and clashing, and much more a focus on trying to keep everything separate and keep everything unique, but in balance. The high priestess symbolizes the subconscious mind and the receptive, reproductive, and form building power within the human organism. Ultimately, at the end of the day, when we take a look from the standpoint of sacred geometry, when you pull out, that circle to become the dyad, this also represents the sacred feminine, or the Vesica Pisces, which is a, which has a lot to do with, Rosicrucian philosophy and esotericism throughout the ages. 2 doesn't factor to a great degree within the Masonic Lodge. I think 2 really, the focus of 2, I think really is the moon in the lodge. And so you have the master of the lodge, the representative of the will of the grand architect of the universe, represented by the sun. Then you have the senior warden, and you have the worshipful master ruling through the day, and the senior warden ruling over the night. And so from that perspective, the number 2 factors into Freemasonry from a standpoint of duality. And again, there is that balance associated with the sun having its appointed time and the moon having its appointed time as well. We move into the triad. The triad really is the reconciliation of the monad and the dyad. And so we have the numeral 1 representing the original state of deity, and then the numeral 2 representing that separation. The triad is then that return to unity, and a way to reach equilibrium between the 2. The triad being the first truly odd number, as Pythagoreans didn't consider the numeral 1 to be a true number, was also considered to be the first perfect number. It's because it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Manly P. Hall writes, "This number is called wisdom because men organize the present, foresee the future, and benefit from the experiences of the past. It is the cause of wisdom and understanding." The triad also gives purpose and movement to the monad. The monad symbolized intellect at rest, and the triad then symbolized intellect in motion. What is intellect in motion but imagination? And so when you look at the Empress card, the Empress is a card that is really above all specifically focused on imagination and production. The Empress is an aspect of the subconscious mind. The ultimately the Empress is with the wheat below her, focused on production and the imagination of all of the material senses. In the Masonic Lodge, 3 is one of the most important spiritual numbers that we have. 3s just pervade the Blue Lodge Masonic experience, from the 3 stationed officers to the 3 great lights, the 3 lesser lights. There's just so much to be said about 3 as an important and critical symbol. And it is just really, really interesting to take a look at the Pythagoreans seeing the triad as an equilibrium, and the ability to turn the will of God into action. And so I liken this to the 3 stationed officers of the lodge, you need the senior warden and the junior warden to then make manifest the will of the worshipful master. The worshipful master represents the will of deity, but the senior warden and junior wardens are the ones who then take that will and make it tangible through all of the running and all the operations of the lodge. Moving into the numeral 4, the Pythagoreans called this the Tetrad, and they revered the Tetrad as the greatest miracle and the root of all things, because it's the first geometric solid, and therefore 4 represents the first perceptible object. Through the Tetrad, humankind was then able to witness all observable phenomena. I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but we do have allusions to a point to a line to a superficie, and superficie to a solid. When you take a look at going from a superficie, which is a 2D shape, to a 3D cube or something along those lines, that then makes an intangible object suddenly perceivable. And so 4 was very much, while 1 was the number of creation, 4 really was the enabler of perception, and 4 is what then enables the human race to observe all phenomena by looking at 1, 2, 3, and 4. The Tetrad introduced and represented the observable scientific wisdom encapsulated in the 4 classical sciences: geometry, arithmetic, music, and astronomy. It also represented the 4 seasons and the 4 elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And Pythagoras himself actually asserted that the human soul was a tetrad consisting of mind, science, opinion, and sense. In his sacred discourse, Pythagoras revered the tetrad due to its relationship with the decad, which is the numeral 10. Numeral 10 was said to be the number of God, and the tetrad comprised kind of that final piece of the first tetractys. And so if you take the sum of the tetrad's constituent parts, we've got 1, so the monad, then we have the dyad, then the triad, and finally the tetrad. You add all of those up together and you get the Pythagorean numeral for God. And so the Pythagoreans very especially venerated the tetractys, stating that within it contained the essence of all things. And so when you look at various forms of arithmetic and numerology, especially looking at some of the things that Pappus writes in his Encyclopedia of Occult Wisdom, you find that really what you have from a sacred numerology perspective is kind of a base 4 system. You have the original, you have the separation, those two make the reconciliation, which is 3, and then 4 becomes the brand new. And so 4 is revered really throughout occult philosophy and thinking, as that really the sum of the first 3 numbers. Looking at number 4 within, I realize I'm motioning off to my other monitor, which has the slides on it, which doesn't provide any frame of reference point for you all, but that's what we do with a live presentation. So when we look at number 4, we see the Emperor within the Rider-Waite Tarot. The Emperor rules conscious existence and represents reason, which is a function of the conscious mind. The Emperor, therefore, rules over everything and sets in order reasoning and conscious elements of the material world. And so through the Emperor, we are now able to not only perceive the perceive the world around us, but we are able to order it and then use a framework like numerology to understand it. In the lodge, we don't pay a lot of attention to the number 4, with the exception, I think, of the 4 points of our entrance, and I think more importantly, the 4 cardinal virtues. So you have temperance, fortitude, prudence, and justice, which are the 4 basic virtues in virtue philosophy that are absolutely critical to have in order to lead a virtuous life. So that's a quick whirlwind tour of of the first 4 numerals in Pythagorean numerology. And what I wanted to return to was this idea of tracing a point all the way to an observable solid. And so when you look at sacred geometry, you start off with the monad, which is that circumpunct point within the circle. It doesn't have a beginning, it doesn't have an end, it just is. When you pull that separation out, you get that vesica Pisces. But in doing so, that monad ceases to become a point, and it now becomes a line between the 2 circles. And so you have this instance where you are moving from a point to a line. And this is, of course, the dyad. Now, when you take that out and go into 3 by putting a circle up here, you can then connect those 3 points and become the triad, which is then your first ever superfice. And so it is a connected 2D geometric shape that has an area that we can perceive. And then moving into the tetrad, we then can think about taking this and flipping it over, and you can see the cube that forms from the tetrad, representing the first solid. So we've talked a little bit about the Pythagorean mystery cult. We've talked about divinatory numerology. Macky being super thrilled about numerology, and we've talked a little bit about kind of the first 4 numbers and what they've meant to the Pythagoreans and how they've translated somewhat into both esoteric wisdom throughout the last several hundred years, but then also the Blue Lodge experience. Whatever became of Pythagoras, what was his numerological legacy? At the end of the day, with the death of Pythagoras, Pythagoreanism really dwindled until it was essentially non-existent by the time of Aristotle. It was about 200 years after the death of Pythagoras. However, in the 1st century Common Era, Pythagoreanism really experienced a resurgence. Platonic philosophers known as the Middle Platonists romanticized Pythagorean ideals, and that led to an emphasis and almost an overemphasis of Pythagoras's mystical nature. And so these Neo-Platonists kind of idealized the Pythagorean mystery school tenets, at least those that they had access to, and started to see Pythagoras not just as a mathematician and philosopher, but an actual magician alongside Solomon and other historical mystics. Kind of concurrent with the formation of this Neo-Pythagorean movement in Greece, Philo Judaeus, whom some scholars argue was a Middle Platonist himself, was a Jewish writer living in Alexandria who drew inspiration from Pythagorean number symbolism to dissect and explain Jewish holy texts. And so you now have, you have a resurgence in Middle Platonic philosophy that is elevating number symbolism from Pythagoras, you have a Jew living in Alexandria who is now starting to take a look at what will become the Tanakh and Torah and Old Testament, and starting to say, well, wait a second, what, where can we put number symbolism into a lens for viewing, the story of creation and things like that. And so using Pythagorean numerology, in one case, Philo argued that the number 6 was the perfect number formed by the multiplication of 2, which is the first female number, and 3, which is the first male number. And so Philo argues for the validity of the Genesis creation account, saying that God didn't create the universe in its contents in 6 days because he had to. He chose that on purpose to rank order his creation according to, the sacred symbolism that was applied to numbers. Philo's extensive treatment of number symbolism, as an aid for exegesis of Jewish texts, kind of, wrapped up with other Platonic philosophies, profoundly influenced the early Middle Christian tradition and ultimately biblical exegesis. Ultimately, there were some early church fathers like Hippolytus that denounced numerology as heresy. Hippolytus and Macky would have been best friends at that point. But starting to get into like the 3rd century Common Era, Augustine of Hippo and Plotinus and the Neoplatonist movement really served to kind of springboard number symbolism as a technique for biblical exegesis, really starting again in the 3rd century Common Era. And that has then carried through, and especially the work of Philo is carried through to the Middle Ages, when we see kind of a resurgence of number symbolism and divinatory numerology in kind of the work of the Jewish Kabbalah that started really around that kind of 1100 to 1300 years Common Era. And so ultimately, at the end of the day, much of what we understand about Pythagoras and his followers is the product of far removed secondary sources and Middle Platonic Romanticism. Again, kind of like Masonry. We have the authors that wrote about Pythagoras. Pythagoras has works attributed to him, but he, it is arguable on whether or not he actually wrote any of those texts. But the profound nature of the cult of Pythagoras is still felt throughout esoteric circles and even into mystical Judaism and mystical Christianity today. And so in the future, my hope is to kind of expand this out and really focus on like 5, 7, and 9 and other numbers that are just absolutely critical to the Masonic experience, and then take a look at where some of the symbolism attached to those numbers meshes or doesn't mesh with the kind of Pythagoreans concepts of numbers. But at this point, I appreciate y'all letting me drone on a little bit for things that I find. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I'm more than happy to take any questions.